At 24, Alara had already lost her father, lost her inheritance, and lost the respect of every person who shared her blood. All her family left her was the right to buy a ruin, a collapsed and forgotten distillery on the edge of town that the world called worthless, purchased for the insulting sum of $1, and her cousins, her aunts, her uncles, they all laughed. They laughed at the closing, a hollow sound in a sterile office, as she signed the papers for a pile of rotting wood and broken brick. But what nobody knew, what not a single one of them could have guessed, was that her father, a man they had dismissed as a failure his entire life, had built a vault into the bedrock beneath the distillery's floor. He had measured twice and cut once, and he had hidden a legacy where no one would ever think to look. That, though, comes later. First, there was the silence, a silence that began the moment her father's heart stopped, and which seemed to follow her everywhere she went. A cold pocket of air in every room. The funeral was a study in polite evasion, a gathering of people who spoke of the weather, of their recent holidays, of the price of fuel, of anything at all except the man in the simple pine box. They remembered him as a ghost long before he had become one, a quiet, stooping figure who smelled of damp oak and sweet mash, a man who ran his family's distillery into the ground, who never had 2 coins to rub together, who let a proud legacy curdle into debt and decay. They called his gentleness weakness, his patience a lack of ambition. Alara sat in the front pew, her hands holding a small, hammered copper cup, dented and dark with tarnish, the one thing she had taken from his bedside table. It was his tasting cup, a thing he was never without, small enough to hide in a fist, its rim worn smooth by his thumb over decades of quiet contemplation. She listened to the eulogy, delivered by a cousin who had not spoken to her father in 10 years, a string of empty platitudes that described a stranger. Not the man who taught her how to read the clouds, not the man who could mend any broken thing with his calloused, careful hands. Not the man whose eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. After the service, her oldest cousin, Finn, approached her, his suit too sharp, his smile too bright. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look like comfort, but felt like a claim. The family had already met, he'd explained. The estate was a mess, mostly debts. The house was mortgaged to the hilt, the savings were a myth. There was nothing. Nothing, that is, except the old distillery, and a developer, a man named Marcus Thorne, had made a generous offer for the land. It was their only way to clear the family name of her father's final, lingering debts. It was, he'd said, the responsible thing to do. She remembered the weight of their collective gaze, the suffocating consensus that she, the quiet daughter of the quiet failure, should be grateful for this clean slate. They saw her as an extension of him, a final, loose thread to be neatly tied off and forgotten. They took the house. They took the savings that weren't there. They took his name and scrubbed it clean with their talk of practicality and moving on. All that was left was the ruin. An asset so worthless they hadn't even bothered to list it properly, an asterisk on a deed tied to acres of sour, unplantable land. And in their haste to liquidate and distance themselves, they had made an error, a small oversight in the legal documents that gave her, as the direct heir, the first right of refusal to purchase the property for a nominal fee if the family chose to dissolve the holding company that owned it. $1. The final insult. She did not sign their papers. She did not agree to the sale. Instead, she went to the bank, withdrew the last of her own meager savings, and hired a lawyer who worked out of a dusty office above the town's bakery. He read the paperwork twice, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was ironclad. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, had given her the one thing she wanted. A week later, in that cold office, she pushed a single, crisp dollar bill across the polished table toward Finn, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. The laughter started then, thin and sharp, as they realized what she had done. She had bought a ghost. She had paid $1 for a decade of unpaid property taxes and a demolition order that was likely already on its way. They thought she was a fool, clinging to a sentimental wreck. They walked out of the office, leaving her alone with the deed and the key, a single piece of rusted iron that looked as ancient as the building it was meant to open. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the room a welcome respite from the noise of their judgment. She held the old key in one hand and the small copper cup in the other, feeling the weight of both. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that the story they told about her father was not the right one. It was a story with pages torn out, a narrative of convenience that made them feel better about their own lives, their own choices. Her father was not a simple man, and he was not a failure. He was a secret, and she had just bought the book he was written in. The laughter faded down the hallway, but she would hear it for weeks. In her sleep, in the quiet moments of the day, it was the sound of the world telling her she had chosen worthlessness over wealth. She tucked the copper cup into her pocket, its familiar dent a small point of comfort against her palm. The key felt cold, the deed felt heavy. She stood up and walked out into the gray afternoon, the owner of nothing. The owner of everything. First, there was the town's memory of him, which was a faulty and unkind thing. They remembered Silas as the man who inherited a thriving distillery and slowly, patiently, ran it into the ground. Old Man Hemlock, who ran the hardware store, would lean on his counter and tell anyone who'd listen that Silas never had a head for business. He'd say Silas was more interested in the way the light hit the dust motes in the aging house than he was in balancing a ledger. He used to say, that man could spend an hour watching a spider spin a web in a barrel stave. An hour! You can't sell webs. And the men drinking coffee at the counter would nod, a chorus of agreement. He was a poor businessman. It was the one thing everyone in town knew for sure. They remembered the slow decline. First, the big contracts were lost. Then the staff was let go, one by one, until it was just Silas, a solitary figure seen through the grime-streaked windows, moving like a phantom among the silent copper stills. They remembered the trucks stopping their weekly runs, the gate growing thick with rust, the paint peeling from the great sign that bore the family name. It became a landmark of failure, a cautionary tale parents told their children about the dangers of dreaming too much and working too little. Ilara, however, remembered something else. She remembered a father who smelled of toasted grain and rain-soaked earth, whose hands, though stained and calloused, could fix the delicate chain on her childhood necklace without breaking the clasp. She remembered him sitting with her on the back steps, pointing out the constellations, telling her that the stars were just old light still traveling, and that nothing good was ever truly lost. He taught her the names of the trees by the texture of their bark, the songs of the birds by the cadence of their calls. He had a way of looking at the world, a deep and patient attention that made small things feel sacred. He used to hold up his little copper tasting cup, swirling a splash of amber liquid, and tell her, "Measure the spirit, not the profit." It was his refrain, the quiet philosophy of his life, a phrase that the rest of the world heard as an excuse for his own insolvency. To her, it had always sounded like a prayer. The wrong, when it came, was delivered with that same chilling politeness that had marked the funeral. Marcus Thorne was a man who looked like he had been assembled from a catalog of expensive things. His suit was sharp, his watch was heavy, his smile was a perfectly calibrated instrument of disarming charm. He spoke about progress and revitalization, about turning the blight of the old distillery into a vibrant commercial center that would bring jobs and prosperity to the town. He spread blueprints across a table, architectural drawings of a world with no room for her father's memory, a place of glass and steel where the scent of oak and malt would be replaced by the sterile hum of air conditioning. Her cousin Finn stood beside him, nodding, acting as the local liaison, the friendly face to smooth over the transaction. He was the one who explained the numbers, the generous offer that would settle all of Silas's debts and even leave a little something for the family to divide. It was presented not as a choice, but as a foregone conclusion, a rescue mission for the family's reputation. They had her cornered, they thought. in a room full of legal documents and familial pressure. They spoke of her father's legacy as a liability, a stain to be washed clean by Thorne's money. The cruelty was not in their words, but in the casual, unthinking way they erased him, reducing his life's work to a line item on a developer's budget. They offered her a check, a small sum for her trouble, a pittance to sign away her grief and walk away quietly. She looked at the check, then at Thorne's expectant face, then at Finn's nervous eyes. She saw the whole story laid bare. They were not just buying land, they were buying absolution. They were paying to forget the man who made them uncomfortable, the man whose quiet, unprofitable existence was a judgment on their own frantic, hungry lives. And they expected her, his daughter, to be the one to sell it to them. The memory of his words came back to her then, clear and strong. Measure the spirit, not the profit. She pushed the check back across the table. She did not say a word. The silence in the room was louder than any argument. It was the moment she stopped being the grieving daughter and became the guardian of something they could not see. It was the moment they stopped seeing her as a nuisance and started seeing her as a problem. The legal battle was short and ugly. They tried to declare her incompetent, emotionally unstable, unfit to make financial decisions. But the quiet lawyer from above the bakery was smarter than they gave him credit for, and the loophole in the charter was undeniable. Her right to purchase was absolute. The day she signed the final papers, Finn's mask of concern slipped. His voice was cold. "You'll regret this, Alara. You've chosen a pile of rocks over your family. That building will be your tomb." He turned and walked away, leaving her with the key and the deed. The threat hung in the air, but beneath it, she felt a flicker of something else, a resolve. She had not chosen a pile of rocks. She had chosen her father. She had chosen his story, and she would find a way to tell it, even if she had to learn the language of stone and rot and silence to do so. The world had told its version. Now it was her turn. The distillery stood on a low hill at the end of a gravel road, hunched against the sky like a tired old animal. Weeds grew thick and high, clawing at the faded clapboard walls, and a shutter hung from a single hinge on an upper window, banging a slow, mournful rhythm in the wind. The great oak door, the main entrance to the bottling house, was streaked with green mildew, but it was solid, its iron strap hinges bolted deep into the frame. Her father had built that door himself, she remembered, after a winter storm had torn the old one from its moorings. He had spent a month on it, planning and joining the thick planks, sealing them with linseed oil until they glowed. It was the one part of the building that seemed to defy the decay, a testament to a time when things were made to last. She put the heavy iron key into the lock. It resisted, stiff with years of disuse, and she had to put her shoulder into it, turning with both hands until there was a loud, groaning crack as the tumblers finally gave way. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, another small ghost of her father's care. The air that rolled out to meet her was thick and cool, a complex perfume of old grain, damp earth, sleeping oak, and the faint, sweet ghost of whiskey. It was the smell of her childhood. It was the smell of him. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her, plunging the vast space into a cathedral-like gloom, lit only by thin shafts of light piercing the grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the beams like tiny, glittering spirits. Everything was coated in a thick, soft blanket of gray dust. The bottling line, a conveyor belt with its machinery frozen in mid-rotation, looked like a fossilized serpent. Pallets of empty, cobweb-shrouded bottles stood in silent ranks. But beneath the dust, she could see the order, the ghost of a system. Tools were not scattered. They were hung on a pegboard wall, their outlines traced in black paint, though some were missing. This was not the chaotic mess of a man who had given up. It was the quiet, orderly space of a man who had simply stopped. As her eyes adjusted, she saw him. A shape, lying on a pile of old grain sacks near the base of the largest fermentation tank. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was a person, but then the shape lifted its head, and two weary, intelligent eyes blinked at her. A tail thumped once, then twice against the burlap. It was Barley, her father's dog. A great, gray-muzzled brute of a dog, a mix of something large and something loyal, with fur the color of a stormy sky. He was old now, stiff in the joints, but his gaze was as clear as ever. He had refused to leave after her father was gone, turning away from the car door when she'd tried to coax him home with her. The neighbors had been leaving food and water for him by the gate, but he had stayed here, a silent, solitary guard. He stood up slowly, his old bones creaking, and padded over to her, his claws clicking softly on the concrete floor. He did not bark. He simply pushed his great head into her hand and sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the last few weeks. She sank to her knees and wrapped her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in his dusty, musty fur. Here was a grief she could understand, a loyalty that asked for nothing. He was the only other living thing that had loved her father without condition. They stayed like that for a long time, two grieving creatures in a silent, forgotten place. When she finally stood, Barley remained at her side, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He was her witness now. Later that afternoon, as she was prying open a swollen window to let in some air, she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel outside. A familiar, slightly battered pickup truck pulled to a stop. Maeve, the woman who ran the town's small grocery store, got out. She was a woman who seemed carved from the local landscape, her face a map of wrinkles, her hands strong and capable. She carried a cardboard box. She walked right up to the open door, not hesitating, and peered into the gloom. "Figured you'd be here," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "Figured you'd be hungry." She set the box down on a dusty crate. Inside was a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, 2 apples, and a thermos of hot coffee. Maeve had known Silas for 50 years. She had never been one for idle gossip, and she had never called him a failure. She looked around the cavernous space, her eyes missing nothing. "This place has good bones," she said, more to herself than to Alara. "Your father, he always saw the bones of things." She looked at Alara, her gaze direct. "Your family, they see the rot. They always have. Don't you listen to them." She patted Alara's arm, a quick, firm gesture. "The dog knows. Animals know who's worth staying for. You trust the dog." And with that, she turned and walked back to her truck, leaving Alara with the food, the coffee, and a small, sturdy seed of hope. She hadn't been asked for anything. She had simply shown up. Alara broke the bread and shared a piece with Barley, who took it gently from her fingers. The two of them sat on the floor, eating in the fading light, the silence no longer feeling empty, but full. Full of a shared history, a quiet understanding. Maeve was right. The dog knew, and he was waiting for her to understand what he already did. He was guarding more than just a building. The days that followed took on a shape, a rhythm of simple, hard work. Alara would arrive at dawn, the key cold in her hand, and Barley would greet her with a soft thump of his tail. She started in one corner of the bottling house, with a broom and a bucket of water, and began the slow, meditative process of cleaning. It was a way of touching every surface her father had touched, of learning the geography of his last years. As she swept away the thick layers of dust and cobwebs, she uncovered not chaos, but a meticulous, if impoverished, order. She found a small workbench where he repaired the machinery himself, with handmade parts fashioned from scrap metal and salvaged wire. There were neatly coiled ropes, stacks of clean rags, and a row of glass jars filled with screws and bolts, sorted by size. This was not the work of a man in despair. This was the work of a man making do, a man holding on. Her father's presence was everywhere, in the faint scent of pipe tobacco that clung to an old jacket slung over a chair, in the worn spot on the floorboards in front of the main still, where he must have stood for countless hours, watching, waiting, in a series of pencil marks on a wooden beam, tracking the height of a young girl who loved to visit her father at work. Her own height. The discovery sent a pang of grief so sharp it made her sit down on the floor, the broom forgotten in her hands. He had not forgotten her, not for a moment. Barley was her constant shadow, following her from room to room, his claws clicking on the concrete. But he had his own ritual. Every afternoon, as the sun began to slant through the western windows, he would leave her side and pad down the rickety wooden steps that led to the cellar. He would disappear into the cool darkness below, and when she followed, she would always find him in the same place. He would be lying on the packed dirt floor, at the far end of the long, narrow cellar, his nose pointed toward the foundation wall. The cellar was where the barrels were once aged, before the business shrank. It was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and mycelium. The walls were rough-hewn granite, slick with condensation, weeping in the humid air. All except for one section. It was at this section that Barley kept his vigil. Ilara didn't notice it at first. She was too busy clearing out rotten pallets and a century of accumulated junk. But after the fourth or fifth day of finding Barley in the exact same spot, she stopped and looked. Really looked. The main foundation was made of massive, irregular blocks of dark, almost black granite, fitted together with thick, crumbling mortar. But the section Barley watched, a stretch of wall about 10 feet wide and 8 feet high, was different. The stone here was a lighter gray. The blocks were more uniform, cut and dressed with a precision the rest of the wall lacked. The mortar was new, a clean, pale line between the stones. And while the rest of the cellar walls glistened with moisture, this section was perfectly, unnaturally dry. It did not sweat. She ran her hand over its surface. It was cool, but not damp. She knocked on it with her knuckles. The sound was a dull, solid thud, just like the rest of the wall. But it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It was too neat, too clean, too new. Her father had been a distiller, not a stonemason. Or so she had thought. But then she remembered his hands, his ability to fix anything. Why would he rebuild a section of the foundation in a cellar he barely used anymore? She tried to reason it away. Maybe there had been a collapse, a repair she didn't know about. But that didn't explain the dog. Barley would lie there for hours, patient and still, as if waiting for a door to open. He would whine softly sometimes, a low, mournful sound, and press his nose against one particular stone in the center of the strange wall. She went over to the spot and examined the stone he favored. It looked no different from the others. She pushed on it. Nothing. She tried to find a seam, a crack, anything that suggested it was a plug or a keystone. But the workmanship was flawless. It was a seamless, solid face of stone. Still, the feeling persisted. It was an anomaly, a question mark in the grammar of the room. It was the one thing that did not fit the story of decay. Decay was loud, it was messy, it was obvious. This wall was quiet, it was neat, and it was hiding something. That evening, she stayed late, long after the sun had gone down. She sat on the dirt floor, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows, and just watched the wall, Barley lying beside her, his head on his paws. The silence in the cellar was absolute. She thought about her cousin's words, a pile of rocks. Maybe he was right. But her father had taught her to look closer, to be patient, to measure the spirit of a thing. And the spirit of this place was not one of surrender. It was one of secrets. The dog sighed, a puff of warm air against her leg. He knew. He was just waiting for her to catch up. The wall was a lock, and somewhere her father had left her the key. She just had to find it. The next morning, she came back not with a broom, but with a hammer and a thin steel chisel. Barley watched her, his tail giving a single, expectant thump. She started with the stone he was so drawn to, the one in the center of the dry section of the wall. She tapped gently at the mortar around it, listening. The sound was different here, a sharper, hollower ring than the dense, damp mortar elsewhere. It was a clue. A small one, but it was enough. She worked carefully, chipping away the pristine mortar, trying not to damage the stone. It came away in clean, dry flakes, unlike the crumbling, powdery decay of the older sections. Underneath, she found not more stone, but a thin, dark line. A gap. It was a door. A stone door, set so perfectly into the wall that it was nearly invisible. Excitement warred with a tremor of fear in her chest. She slid the chisel into the gap and pried. The stone groaned, scraping against its neighbors, but it moved. Just a fraction of an inch at first, then more as she put her weight into it. It wasn't hinged. It was a plug, a massive, perfectly balanced block designed to pivot on a central pin. With a final, shuddering scrape, the stone swung inward, revealing a cavity of perfect, silent darkness. The air that flowed out was not the damp, earthy smell of the cellar. It was cool and dry, smelling faintly of old wood and something else, something rich and complex and wonderful. It was the concentrated ghost of 1,000 barrels of sleeping whiskey. She retrieved her lantern and held it up to the opening. The light cut through the blackness and fell upon a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not a small cavity, it was a vault. A long, vaulted chamber carved directly out of the bedrock, its ceiling a smooth, curved arch. And lining the walls, stacked 3 high on sturdy wooden racks, were barrels. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Each one was made of dark, almost black oak, bound with clean, unrusted iron hoops. They were covered in a thin, even layer of dust, but they were pristine. On the end of each barrel hung a small wooden tag with letters and numbers burned neatly into the surface. At the far end of the vault, she could see a small wooden desk and a single chair. On the desk sat a thick, leather-bound book. This was it. This was the secret. This was the place her father had gone when the world thought he was simply giving up. He wasn't letting the distillery die. He was building an ark. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where a daughter begins to understand her father not as the world saw him, but as he truly was. It is the part where a legacy of quiet, unseen goodness is finally brought into the light. Because what Alara found in that vault was more than just old whiskey. She found the heart of a man who had turned his back on the world's definition of success to create a currency all his own, a currency of kindness, of honor, and of grace. She stepped into the vault, Barley padding silently at her heels. The stone plug swung shut behind them with a soft click, and for a moment, they were sealed in, a world away from the noise and the judgment and the greed. The lantern light danced across the rows of barrels, illuminating the tags. C 1998, R 2003, S 2011. It was a library of time, a collection of sleeping spirits. She ran her hand over the cool, dusty surface of the nearest barrel. The wood was smooth, the craftsmanship perfect. She walked slowly toward the desk at the back. The air was still and sacred, like a church. The leather-bound book on the desk was a distiller's log. She opened it. The first page was dated 30 years ago. The handwriting was her father's, a neat, meticulous script. The entry was not about mash bills or fermentation times. It was about a neighbor. John Abernathy, it read. Roof on his barn collapsed in the winter storm. Wife is sick. Gave him the lumber he needed. Paid in full. And beside the entry, a note. Barrel A-1992. For his daughter's wedding. She turned the page, and another, and another. The book was filled with entries just like it. A doctor's bill paid for a child with a fever. A new well dug for a farmer during a drought. Seed grain for a family whose crop had failed. Each entry was a quiet act of kindness, a debt settled not with money but with a promise. A barrel of whiskey, laid down to age, marked with the family's initial and the year. He wasn't a failed businessman. He was the town's secret banker, its silent benefactor, the hidden pillar that had held up so many lives. He had been trading his life's work, the one thing of value he could create, for the well-being of his community. He had been measuring the spirit, not the profit. A wave of understanding so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over her. All the years of perceived failure, of quiet shame, of whispered gossip, it was all a lie. He had been carrying the weight of this town on his shoulders, and no one had ever known. He had let them think he was a fool, a failure, because the privacy of their need was more important to him than the preservation of his own pride. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak, and pulled the heavy ledger into her lap. Arlie laid his head on her knee, his warm presence a grounding force in the swirling vortex of her emotions. She began to read, to unravel the secret history of a man and of a town that had never truly known him. The story was just beginning. She spent the next days in the vault, a subterranean scholar in a library of ghosts. With the ledger open on the desk and the lantern casting a warm, steady glow, she pieced together the last 30 years of her father's life. The book was a meticulous record of a hidden economy, a world that ran on a currency of honor. Each barrel was a promise, a debt of gratitude paid forward. There was a barrel for the midwife who had delivered half the children in the county, marked with a simple M. There were barrels for the volunteer firemen, laid down after they'd saved the old Grange Hall from burning to the ground. There was a barrel for Maeve, from the grocery store, dated the year her husband had passed away, with a note beside it. For keeping us all fed. Alara began to cross-reference the barrel tags with the ledger entries. Our 2003 was for the Reavers, a family whose farm had almost gone under. Her father had anonymously paid their bank loan. 2011 was for the school, a new slate roof he'd funded after a leak had ruined the classrooms. He hadn't been squandering his money. He had been investing it in people. The distillery hadn't failed because he was a bad businessman. It had failed because he was giving its heart away, barrel by barrel, act by quiet act. While she was discovering this secret history, the world outside was closing in. One afternoon, she emerged from the cellar, blinking in the bright sunlight, to find a notice plastered to the great oak door. It was an official-looking document, its bold, black letters stark against the weathered wood. Condemned. The building had been declared a public hazard by the town council. A demolition order had been issued. All work on the property was to cease immediately. Demolition was scheduled in 2 weeks. Her blood ran cold. Thorne. It had to be him. He hadn't been able to buy her out, so he was going to legislate her out. He was using the levers of bureaucracy to finish what he'd started. The next day, Finn's car pulled up the gravel drive. He didn't get out. He just rolled down the window, his face pale and strained. "Alara, just stop this," he said, his voice tight. "Thorne is not a man you want to cross. He's got the whole council in his pocket. He's calling in favors. This is over. Take the last offer he made you and walk away before you have nothing." "This place isn't nothing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not for sale." "It's a pile of wood," he almost shouted, his composure cracking. "My father would have to sell his business to pay back Thorne if this deal goes south. Do you understand? You're not just being sentimental, you're hurting the family. Your own family." He looked away from her then, unable to meet her gaze. "Just sign the papers, Alara. Please." He drove away in a spray of gravel, leaving her with the weight of his fear. The threat was no longer just about a building. It was about tearing apart what little was left of her family, pitting them against each other. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her shoulders. She retreated to the vault, the one place she felt safe, the one place the noise of the world couldn't reach her. The quiet rows of barrels seemed to offer a silent strength. She was their guardian now, the keeper of these promises. She felt a surge of anger, a cold, clear indignation at the injustice of it all. Marcus Thorne, with his easy money and his slick promises of progress, was trying to bulldoze a cathedral of kindness to build a shopping mall. He saw only blight, a negative on a balance sheet. He was blind to the decades of grace and dignity sleeping in the cool, dark earth beneath his feet. She ran her hand over the ledger, the paper soft as cloth, the ink faded but clear. Her father had fought his battle with quietness, with patience, with retreat. But that was not her battle to fight. Her battle required a voice. It required light. The demolition date was a deadline, a ticking clock. She had less than 2 weeks to find a way to make the world see what she saw, to prove that the value of this place could not be measured in square footage or lumber. She thought of the names in the ledger, the people all over town who had been touched by her father's secret generosity. They were the key. They were the other half of the story. She closed the heavy book, a new resolve hardening inside her. Her father had written his legacy in secret. It was her job to publish it. She would not let them tear this place down. She would not let them erase him. She would take their condemnation notice, and she would turn it into a congregation. The fight was no longer just for a building, but for a man's soul, for the very definition of a life well lived. As she was carefully packing the first ledger into a canvas bag, her hand brushed against a thick envelope tucked into a leather sleeve on the inside cover. It had been there the whole time, but in her frantic reading, she had overlooked it. On the front, in her father's familiar script, was a single word, Ilera. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a letter from the dead. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, a small, simple S pressed into the dark red wax. She unfolded the pages. The letter was dated just 6 months before he died, written at the small desk in the vault. "My dearest Ilera," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means you have found my true distillery. I hope it wasn't too much trouble. I always knew you had a knack for seeing things others missed. I trust Barley showed you the way. He is a better keeper of secrets than I ever was." A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She could hear his voice in the words, the quiet, wry cadence of it. "I imagine you have questions. I imagine you may even be angry with me for the secrets, for the appearance of failure I allowed the world to see. For that, I am sorry. It was never my intention to cause you shame. The truth is, I made a choice a long time ago. I saw what the world valued: speed, growth, profit at all costs. And I saw that it was a hollow thing. It was a language I could not, and would not, speak. So I built a place that spoke mine. This vault, this library of spirits, is the result. It is not a business. It is a record of a community. Each barrel is a story, a moment when someone chose to help someone else. I was merely the bookkeeper." He went on to explain his system. The local doctor who accepted whiskey as payment for treating families who couldn't pay. The builder who would trade his labor for a few cases to share with his crew. It was a network, a quiet, underground economy of mutual support with a distillery at its heart. He was the inker, turning his craft into a tangible form of grace. "They will tell you I was a poor man," he wrote, "and by their measure, they are right. I have no money to leave you. I am leaving you something far more burdensome and far more valuable, a choice. What you hold in your hands is a fortune in aged spirits. A collector would pay millions for what is in this room. You could sell it all, live a comfortable life, and no one would blame you. It is, by all rights, yours. Or, you could choose to honor the promises. You could see that these barrels get to the families for whom they were intended. Many are for weddings of children who were not yet born when the promise was made, for retirements, for hard times. The ledgers hold the stories. The choice is yours. To convert it all to money, or to convert it to meaning. I will not tell you which to choose. A true inheritance is not a gift, but a question. And I trust you, my daughter, more than anyone, to find the right answer." The last lines of the letter were about her. "I have watched you grow into a woman with a kind heart and a strong spirit. You have my patience, but you also have your mother's fire. You were my greatest creation, my finest spirit, the one thing in my life I am most proud of. Do not let anyone, especially our own family, tell you who you are. You are the daughter of a distiller. You know how to wait, and you know what is worth waiting for. "Whatever you choose, you have my blessing, always." He signed it simply, "Your father." At the very bottom of the page, there was a postscript, a single sentence: "Measure the spirit, not the prophet." She folded the letter, her tears soaking into the heavy paper. The guilt, the anger, the confusion, it all washed away, replaced by a profound and aching love. He had not abandoned her. He had trusted her. He had left her not a fortune, but a purpose. He had given her the keys to his kingdom, and the freedom to be its queen or to dismantle it for coin. The choice was not a burden. It was the greatest gift he could have possibly given her. She stood up, the letter clutched in her hand. The demolition notice, the threats from Thorn, the fear in Finn's eyes, they all seemed smaller now, viewed from the deep, quiet center of this vault. She knew what she had to do. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stand her ground, not just for her father, but for every name in his ledger. She would honor the promises. She packed the first ledger and the letter carefully into her bag. She took one last look around the vault, at the silent, waiting barrels. They were not just assets, they were souls. They were the stored and sleeping kindness of a lifetime. She walked out of the vault and into the light, ready for the fight. She was no longer just a grieving daughter. She was an executor of a will written in oak and honor. The town council meeting was held in the old municipal hall, a room that always felt cold, no matter the season. The walls were paneled in dark, somber wood, and the air smelled of floor wax and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unflattering glare on the faces of the council members, who sat on a raised dais like bored monarchs. The room was half full, with a smattering of townspeople, most of them drawn by the minor drama of the distillery's demolition. Marcus Thorne was already there, standing at the front, schmoozing with the council president. He was a portrait of relaxed confidence, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the room's drab utility. He nodded and smiled, his movements smooth and practiced. Ilara saw Finn sitting in the back row, his shoulders hunched, his face ashen. He wouldn't look at her. She took a seat in the front, placing her canvas bag on the floor beside her. Inside was the first ledger, her father's letter, and the small, dented copper cup. She held the cup in her hand, its familiar weight a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. Barley was waiting for her in the truck, a silent, steady ally. The meeting was called to order. After a few tedious procedural matters, the distillery was announced as the main agenda item. Thorne strode to the podium, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He began to speak, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. He spoke of progress, of safety, of fiscal responsibility. He painted a picture of the distillery as a cancerous blight, a dangerous ruin that was dragging down property values and posing a threat to the community's children. He used words like eyesore, hazard, and insolvent legacy. He spoke of her father not with malice, but with a kind of pitying condescension that was somehow worse. He called him a well-meaning but misguided man, a hobbyist who unfortunately inherited a real business. With every word, he diminished her father, sanding away the edges of his life until all that was left was a smooth, simple narrative of failure. The proposed demolition, Thorne concluded, his eyes sweeping the room, is not just a practical necessity, it is an act of compassion. It allows us to close a sad chapter in this town's history and begin a new one of growth and prosperity for all. He nodded to the council and returned to his seat amidst a smattering of polite applause. The council president, a man with a perpetually tired expression, looked down at his papers. The council has reviewed the engineering reports. The structure is unsound. The demolition order stands. Miss, he fumbled for her name, is there anything you wish to say before we finalize the vote? All eyes turned to her. The silence was heavy, expectant. She felt small, a solitary figure against the tide of officialdom and money. She took a deep breath. the cool metal of the copper cup pressing into her palm. She walked to the podium. She did not bring any papers with her. She placed the cup on the wooden ledge in front of her. "My name is Alara," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and started again, louder this time. "My name is Alara. My father was Silas. You all knew him." She looked out, not at the council, but at the faces in the audience. "Mr. Thorne calls my father's legacy insolvent. He calls this building a blight. He is mistaken." She reached into her bag and pulled out the thick leather ledger. She laid it on the podium with a solid, satisfying thud. "My father was a distiller, but that was not his only business. This," she said, tapping the cover of the book, "is the record of his real work." She opened it to a page she had marked. "In the spring of 1998, she read, her voice clear and steady, "the elementary school roof was damaged by a storm. The insurance wouldn't cover the full cost of a new slate roof. The school board was going to have to settle for cheap asphalt shingles." She paused, looking up. "But they didn't. They got a full slate roof. No one ever knew where the extra funding came from. They called it an anonymous donation." She looked directly at an elderly woman in the second row, the retired school principal. "My father paid for that roof. In exchange, he laid down 1 barrel of his finest single malt. It's in his vault now, marked S-1998. It was to be opened on the school's 100th anniversary." A murmur went through the crowd. The principal's eyes were wide. Thorne shifted in his seat, his smile gone. Alara turned the page. In 2003, the Reaver farm was in foreclosure. The bank was going to auction it off. She found the face of a man in the back, a weathered farmer in his late 50s. An investor from out of state bought the debt at the last minute and gave the family favorable terms to pay it back. That investor was my father. The payment he took was a promise. A barrel, marked R-2003, to be given to your son on his wedding day. The farmer stood up, his face a mask of stunned realization. That was your father," he stammered. Alara nodded. And then it started. Like a dam breaking. A voice from the side called out. "The town well, it went dry in the drought of 95. Someone paid to have a new one dug. We thought it was the county." Alara found the entry in the book. "He did," she confirmed. "Barrel W-1995. One by one, the stories came out, unlocked by the ledger. The fire truck engine he'd paid to have rebuilt. The doctor's bills he'd settled. The bridge repairs he'd funded. The room was no longer a cold, official chamber. It was a confessional. It was a testament. It was a room full of people realizing they were all connected by a web of kindness they had never seen. A web that emanated from the quiet man they had all dismissed. Her father had not failed the town. He had built it. The atmosphere in the hall had transformed. The sterile, bureaucratic proceeding had become a living, breathing testimony. The community chorus, once a scattered collection of passive observers, was now a unified voice, each story adding another thread to the rich tapestry of her father's secret life. Thorne sat frozen in his chair, his face a pale, tight mask of fury. His well-ordered world of spreadsheets and profit margins was crumbling around him, being replaced by an economy of ghosts and honor he could not comprehend. Alara felt a surge of strength. She was no longer speaking for herself. She was speaking for him, for all of them. She turned a few more pages in the ledger, her fingers tracing the elegant, faded script. She stopped at an entry from long ago, dated 1985. The name written there made her pause. "Thorne." "What is it?" the council president asked, leaning forward, now fully engaged. "In 1985, Alara said, her voice dropping slightly, a small shipping business in the next town over was on the brink of bankruptcy. A bigger company was trying to squeeze them out. The owner was a good man, but he was in over his head. He needed a bridge loan to survive, but no bank would give it to him. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, whose face had gone from pale to sheet white. "My father gave him the loan," she said quietly. "He asked for no interest. He asked for nothing in return, except that the man do the same for someone else someday. The debt," she read from the ledger, her voice resonating in the silent room, "is considered paid in full." She closed the book. "That man's name was Alistair Thorne, your father, Mr. Thorne." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Marcus Thorne looked as if he had been struck. He stared at Alara, his mouth slightly open, a universe of confusion and shame in his eyes. He was trying to tear down a monument built, in part, by a lifeline thrown to his own family. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. It was then that Finn, who had been sitting hunched and invisible in the back, stood up. He looked terrible, his face blotchy, his eyes red. He stumbled forward, past the rows of silent townspeople, until he stood in the aisle. "He's right," Finn choked out, his voice thick with tears. "She's right about all of it." All eyes swiveled to him. "Thorne, he put pressure on us, on my father. He threatened to ruin him, to call in markers. We were scared." He looked at Alara, his gaze finally meeting hers, and it was filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "I knew it was wrong. I knew your father was a good man. But I was weak. I was a coward. I told you that you were choosing rocks over family. But he was the only one who ever understood what family meant." He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, a broken man. "We lied about the reports. The building isn't unsound. We paid an engineer to say what Thorne wanted him to say. It's solid. It's the best built structure in this whole county. My grandfather saw to that, and Silas, he honored it. He maintained it." The confession hung in the air, a stunning admission of fraud and conspiracy. The council members stared, mouths agape. The townspeople murmured, a low rumble of anger directed now at Thorne. Finn took a ragged breath. "I'm sorry, Alara. I am so sorry." He turned and walked, not back to his seat, but out the main doors of the hall, a man walking into a self-imposed exile, finally choosing truth over fear. The spell was broken. Marcus Thorne stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He didn't look at anyone. He stared at the floor, his face a ruin. Without a word, he strode quickly out of the room, following the path of his disgraced accomplice. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving a void where his power and influence had been just minutes before. The council president cleared his throat, looking dazed. He looked at Alara, then at the ledger, then at the faces of his constituents, who were now looking at him, their expressions clear. They were waiting. "In light of this testimony," he said, his voice unsteady, "the motion to demolish is rescinded. This meeting is adjourned." He banged the gavel, a sharp, final crack that echoed the breaking of the old narrative. No one moved to leave. Instead, a slow, quiet migration began. People rose from their seats and drifted toward the front of the room, toward Alara. The old farmer, Reaver, was the first. He put a calloused hand on her shoulder. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the best man I ever knew." The retired principal followed, her eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling us." One by one, they came. Not with loud praise, but with quiet nods, soft-spoken words, and shared looks of understanding. They were repaying a debt of memory, acknowledging the man they had wronged with their ignorance. Alara stood there, clutching the copper cup, as the community her father had secretly built cohered around her, no longer invisible, but a living, breathing force in the cold municipal hall. The room was warm now. In the days that followed the council meeting, a quiet transformation began. The story spread through the town, not like wildfire, but like a slow, rising tide, seeping into every corner, every conversation. The narrative of Silas the failure was washed away, replaced by the legend of Silas the benefactor. The distillery was no longer an eyesore. It was a landmark, a monument to a different kind of wealth. The first to arrive was Maeve in her battered pickup truck. She didn't bring food this time. She brought 2 of her stock boys, a collection of shovels, and a weed whacker. "Figured you could use a hand clearing the grounds," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She didn't wait for an answer, just set her crew to work cutting back the years of neglect. By noon, the great oak door was visible from the road for the first time in a decade. Soon after, others came. The farmer, Reaver, arrived with his tractor and a mower attachment and began to cut a neat path up the long drive. The son of the town's electrician, a young man who had learned his trade at his father's side, showed up with a toolbox and started inspecting the building's ancient wiring, whistling as he worked. A crew of volunteer firemen appeared one Saturday with ladders and buckets and began the painstaking work of washing the grime from the high windows. No one asked for payment. No one was asked to come. They just showed up, drawn by a collective sense of duty and a desire to make amends, in their own small way, to the man they had misunderstood. They were a quiet army, armed with tools and goodwill. Ilara, overwhelmed at first, soon found her rhythm among them. She directed the work, her knowledge of the building's quirks and secrets suddenly invaluable. She made coffee on a camp stove and shared the bread and cheese that Maeve now dropped off daily. She learned the names of people she had only ever known as faces. They, in turn, began to call her by her father's name, a slip of the tongue at first, then a term of respect. "Silas's girl," they'd say. "She knows where things go." One afternoon, a sleek, unfamiliar car pulled up the newly cleared drive. A woman in a sharp business suit got out. She introduced herself as a representative from a world-renowned spirits auction house. The story had reached farther than Ilara had imagined. The woman had heard rumors of a lost collection of perfectly aged, pre-industrial single malts. She made Ilara an offer that was staggering, a number with so many zeros it seemed fictional. It was a sum that could have bought her a new life anywhere in the world, a life of ease and comfort, free from the burden of this place. It was the choice her father had laid out for her in his letter. Convert it to money, or convert it to meaning. She thought of the names in the ledger. She thought of the farmer's son who would one day get married. She thought of the school's anniversary. She looked at the group of townspeople taking a break in the shade, sharing a thermos of water, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. They were laughing. "It's not for sale," Ilara said, the words feeling more right than any words she had ever spoken. The woman looked at her, then at the bustling activity around the old building, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. She saw a fortune being squandered on sentiment. She shrugged, handed Ilara a business card, "In case you change your mind," and drove away, leaving a small cloud of dust in her wake. That evening, as the volunteers packed up their tools, Finn appeared at the edge of the property. He stood there for a long time, just watching. He had a hammer and a tool belt in his hands. He didn't approach Ilara. He simply found a loose section of siding on the back of the building and, without a word, began to work. His hammer blows hesitant at first, then falling into a steady, penitent rhythm. It was a start. It was an apology made of labor, not words. Ilara watched him for a moment, then turned back to her own work. Forgiveness was a process, as slow and patient as the aging of whiskey. The distillery was becoming a new kind of community center, a place where the town was rebuilding its own soul by rebuilding the walls that had secretly sheltered it for so long. The found family, the one her father had cultivated in secret, was finally gathering in the light. She had made her choice. She had refused the money. She had chosen the meaning. And in doing so, she found she was richer than she could have ever imagined. The legacy was not in the barrels. It was in the work. It was in the showing up. Winter melted into a damp, green spring, and the distillery continued its slow resurrection. The new roof, a patchwork of salvaged slate and donated labor, no longer leaked. The windows, reglazed and painted, shone in the afternoon sun. The grounds were clear, and a small vegetable garden, planted by Maeve, was beginning to sprout near the back door. The place was breathing again. Ilara had established a community trust to manage the distillery and its assets, with a board made up of Maeve, the farmer Reaver, and the retired school principal. The vault was no longer a secret, but its contents were not for sale. They were a promise. The first barrel was opened for the wedding of the farmer's son, just as the ledger had decreed. The whole town was invited. They held the reception in the great hall of the bottling house, which had been scrubbed clean and strung with lights. The whiskey, a spirit laid down over 20 years ago, was the color of dark honey, and it tasted of oak and thyme and honor. It was a taste of her father's spirit, and it was shared by all. Ilara, running the place now, found a new purpose. She wasn't a master distiller like her father, not yet. But she was a patient student. She spent her evenings in the vault, reading his other ledgers, the ones that detailed not his kindness, but his craft. She learned about mash bills and yeast strains and the subtle art of the cut. Finn, quiet and diligent, became her apprentice, his penance a daily devotion to the work. He was learning to measure the spirit, not the profit, one day at a time. The town, in turn, supported them. They bought the small, unaged batches of clear spirit she was beginning to produce, a fiery, youthful whiskey sold in simple, unlabeled bottles. They didn't buy it because it was great whiskey. They bought it because it was hers. Because it was his. It was their way of investing back into the heart of their community. One cool evening in late autumn, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden light across the valley, a car sputtered to a stop on the road just outside the distillery gate. A young couple and their small child got out, the man staring at the engine with a look of helpless frustration. Ilara watched them from the open doorway of the bottling house, a scene echoing from the past. Barley, now very old and slow, lifted his head from his spot by the door and gave a soft woof. She went inside and came back with a thick wool blanket and a small silver flask filled with the last of the whiskey from the barrel opened for the wedding. She walked down the gravel drive, Barley trotting stiffly beside her. The young woman looked up, startled, as she approached. "Car trouble," the man said, wiping his greasy hands on his jeans. "Looks like we're stuck for the night." Ilara smiled, a gesture that was her father's. "It gets cold out here when the sun goes down," she said, handing the blanket to the woman. "And this might help." She gave the flask to the man. "There's a phone inside you can use. And a warm place to wait for the tow truck." The couple stared at her, stunned by the unquestioning kindness. We can't pay you," the woman said softly. Ilara looked past them, at the distillery standing proud on the hill, its windows glowing with warm light. She felt the weight of the small copper cup, which she now carried always in her pocket. She thought of her father, of the first entry in his secret ledger, a story of a stranded family on a cold night. The circle was closing. "It's already been paid for," she said, "a long time ago." She turned and walked back toward the light, the old dog at her heel, leaving the family wrapped in a warmth that had been aging for decades, a legacy of quiet goodness still pouring out into the world. Her father was gone, but his spirit remained, measured out, one small act of grace at a time. Measure the spirit, not the profit. The words were no longer a memory. They were a map. They were the way home.